Hello everyone, good evening. Today we have a presentation on the paper of contemporary literature. In that, I would like to give a presentation on the topic of reconstructed memory of love in the Julian Barnes' The Only Story. Here is information about me. My table of content is that first of all, introduction of the author and novel, introduction about my presentation, reconstructed memory of the novel, and conclusion. So, this is quote from the novel, The Only Story. This describes the significance of the title that Barnes described that most of us have only one story to tell. I don't mean that only one thing happens to us in our lives. There are countless events which we turn into countless stories, but there is only one that matters, only one finally worth telling. This is mine. About the author that Julian Barnes, that he was born 19 January in 1946. He write many novels, short story, essays, and memoirs, and for that he got many notable awards. About the only story that it is the memory novel, and it was published in 1st February 2018. uh, so about the some throw some light on the only story that Paul Roberts is the protagonist of the this short novel. The setting is the early 1916, which with a few allusion to present events. Paul joins the tennis club, which is one of few social activities available in such settings. He is paired with Susan McLeod, a 1480-year-old married woman with two daughters older than Paul. In a mixed doubles match, surprisingly, Paul and Susan fall in love, and Susan finally abandons her family to live with Paul in South London. Susan quickly slides into drunkenness and dementia due a lack of activities other than housekeeping. Paul sets out on a journey around the world, picking up jobs and ladies as he goes. Paul is a character who epitomizes alienation. He has no interest in a political or religion and no specific aim, so he just goes with the flow. He freely confesses that recollection is unreliable and that he may not be telling us the truth when he recounts his life in this book. Introduction. The only story is largely concerned with the nature of love and how it affects those who are involved. The story begins with a quotation from Dr. Samuel Johnson, an 18th century poet, essayist, and literary critic. Dr. Johnson identifies that newly emerging genre of the novel as a little tale, typically of love, in a dictionary of the English language. Barnes remarked that unlike Dr. Johnson's sarcasm, does not seem to question the novel as a form or love as is a central focus. The only story of the so-called title Little Tale, as a Barnes demonstrates in this novel, it should be love. Barnes challenges us to question our traditional idea of love by concentrating on the interactions of the concept of love from a constantly changing perspective. The narrator starts his narration with a broad statement in this case. On the first page, he engaged in an imaginary dialogue with his idle hypothetical audience. This is the quotation which the novel begins, that would you rather love the more and suffer the more, or love the less and suffer the less? That is, I think, finally the only real question. You may point out correctly that is not a real question, because we don't have the choice. If we had the choice, then there would be a question, but we don't. So there is not. Who can control how much they love? If you can control it, then it is not love. I don't know what you call it instead, but is not love. Let's talk about narrative technique of this novel. That the only story is a courtly tale experienced and narrated by its central character narrator called Paul Roberts. The only stories, narrative events, and situations are portrayed in an ironological order. The first part is told in first person, the second is in primarily second person, and the third in third person. The author used his method of narrative to present the nature and definition of love from several angles. And part one of the story is about love's birth. Part two is about love's death or test, and part three is about love's aftermath or effect. Similarly, the different chapters of the novel is recounted in a varied modes and formats depending on their substance. In other words, the narrative discourse combines the perceptions and reports of the experiencing and the narrative. As Julian points out that in each novel, Barnes seeks to explore a new area of experience and play with different narrative modes. Hence, presenting the plot in a number of modalities is regarded a Barnesian element of narration. Coming to the point that reconstructed memory of love. The narrative in a part three is haunted with some particular moment of his unforgettable experience in the past. By reviewing some of the events that finally led to his separation with Susan, he tells us how, in the last part of the relationship, he gradually could replace his need for Susan with other satisfactions, such as his job, which provided him with the sexual companionship, the social life, the daily warmth he needed. More than in the previous parts, the narrator in part 3 realized on the constructive role of memory in coming to terms with the traumatic past. Part 3 of the only story can be read separately from the previous two parts. Part 3 in comparison accurately reflects the Barnes' taste and interest. In Cornelia Stott's work, that Barnes is very interested in answering questions concerning memory, finding ways of making the past accessible, and dealing with the tendency of voting to change the view of the past to fit the present. According to Child's argument, that Barnes' novels can sometimes seem like conversational forests that develop a line of throughout about society and culture into all kinds of fictional avenue, but they are also often formally unusual and almost previously experimental. In this part, Paul recounts his memories of this one and only narrative, which he considered to be the most significant event in his life. The narrator realized his third person reflection on their amazing encounter 5 decades later, believing it will help him evaluate his life more accurately. Part 3 of Barnes' story depicts Paul as a wise elderly man in his 70s. The first part starts with a note in Paul's notepad. For him, finding a definition of love has become an unhealthy fixation. After meditating on the meaning of love for a long time, he has discovered that love is an elusive and illusory idea that is continually being erased. He considered truth to be a transient and multifaceted concept. He has realized, however, that love, even awful love, never goes away. Bad love held a sliver, a memory of good love somewhere deep below, where neither of them wanted a deep. Many of his strict ideas about concept and people are revised, but he cannot forget his encounter with Susan. It's only story he is ever told. Part 3 is make believe reconstruction of the narrator's previous life based on his memories. This section out of 3 has the most in common with overall question of Barnes' work. According to Julian, the important concern developed in his prior works include the evasiveness of truth, the fabrication of history, and the elusive nature of the memory. In this scene Paul seeks select in his own memories. Despite his awareness of memory's unreality, Paul makes an effort to reconstruct his life with Susan accurately. According to Chaldes, ironic, comedy, and false memory are two of poles around which Julian Barnes' work revolves. If the past is alive for us in the present because we remember it, Barnes' fiction would suggest that it is not necessarily the past that we remember. The version and the details that inhibit memories are mutable, are changeable. Recollections, fashion, a current sense of identity, and arguably vice versa. But for Barnes, the most important aspect of the memory is that it is imaginative. In the third part, Paul uses his imagination to rebuild his recollection. As a result, he is able to transfer his memories into the things he desired. He encounters a unique form of love based on sharing singularity. He aspects his Susan difference at a long last. Aside from that, he attributes his unfulfilled life to the village communal life structure, his problem with unnoticed by everyone. Paul tries to reorder his beliefs on love and his early 20s life as a result of his memories. In other words, as he gets older, he becomes more adaptable. Paul's introspection leads him in a discovering a new part of his own personality. He discovers, for example, that he has been a coward for the majority of his life, despite the fact that he had no obligations as a result of the village's religious, patriarchal, hierarchical framework. He confessed that his freedom has had some repercussions. Part 3 concludes with the narrator's deep intellectual thinking on love. He is now primarily concerned with a reasonable definition of love as well as the nature of his own experience with it. Love, he concludes, is a painful experience because no one can experience love without being injured. He favors this definition of love among his many others. In my opinion, every love, happy or unhappy, is a real tragedy once you give yourself over it completely. He ultimately admits that his love had turned out to be a complete disaster for him. Perhaps he had been securing his time all along. Perhaps love could never be defined, it could only ever be defined in a picture, in a story. The narrator does not seek forgiveness or redemption despite his cognitive and emotional development. He just resolves to confront the reality of his own past life, a minimalistic version of which swiftly goes through the shifting mind. As a result of the drastic shift of perspective regarding this past life and experience, his greatest concern in the end is the prospect of his future life. This dialogue from that, I looked at her profile and thought back to some moments from my own private cinema. But after a few minutes of this, my mind began to wonder. I couldn't keep it on love and loss, on fun and grief. I didn't feel guilty about any of this. Indeed, I think I am now probably done with guilt. But the rest of my life, such as it was and subsequently would be, was calling me back. Paul finally discovers a method to resolve a lengthy and ongoing inner struggle that has traumatized his soul for nearly 5 decades. He acknowledges the deceives role of extra personal elements like as a time, social institution, individual differences, and the illusory and manufactured character of memory when it comes to human relationship and emotions. He finally subdues his probing, judgy, and tediously repeating perspective on his first love experience and subsequent perception about it later in life. Such a shift in a perspective propels him into a new era of his life. So let's sum up that in a conclusion, through the reconstructed nature of memory, the only story reveals the illusion of love and share oneness. His narrator is able to recognize that his love affair with his lover was mostly founded on a certain mutual unmet and expectations. The narrator portrays his romantic experience as a unique occurrence in a European culture during the 1960s. Paul was he couldn't make the connection between his values and those of others, including Suzanne's and his own family, while he was in a 20s. Here is my references. Thank you.
Need, in the needed. The question is why Julian Barnes described Paul as a unreliable narrator.
Because whatever Paul is described and tell us in the whole novel, it is based on memory. So as we know that memory is not reliable. So that's why Julian Barnes described the Paul as a unreliable narrator.
Okay, so according to you, how memory becomes important, and do you find any significance in this novel?
Yes, I find that we can see that in a novel, when there is a one person sitting there in his old age and going back into the past of his personal life and telling us the story of his life to us. That person will go back into through their memory. So that is only way to go in the past from through the memory. So we will have to revisit our memory to tell others.